You are listening to Insights from the Conference Board.
Welcome to DEI-logue, part of the Human Capital Insights podcast channel here at the Conference Board. My name's John Brewer. I'm the Programme Director for the Board's DEI conference, which is coming up on May 24, 25 and 26. And this podcast series is going to feature speakers from the event so that you can get an idea of some of the issues we're going to be talking about and get to know the speakers and really dive a little bit deeper into some of the things they're going to be talking about. So welcome, and I'm going to welcome our first guest today, Deanna Ransom, who's the Chief Marketing Officer with Televerdi. So welcome, Deanna. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, John. I'm so glad to be here.
I want to start first, and we just briefly, maybe you could explain a little bit about the work Televerdi does, because we had one of your folks speak last year, and it's one of the reasons why I reached out to you for this event in May. So outline a little bit about the work that Televerdi does for us, please.
Absolutely. So Televerdi is a global revenue creation partner for B2B businesses. However, we are a purpose-driven company. And what I mean by that is we provide second chance hiring to incarcerated women currently in 3 countries. And so, what I mean by second chance hiring is a large portion of our workforce is incarcerated while they are working and getting additional skills and education so that they can continue to live a productive life upon exit from prison.
Right. And like I say, we had one of your people speak in November. And as a result of that, I saw the article, which is what we're going to talk about, the bulk of our conversation today, an article that you wrote that was first published in Fast Company and then taken up by Fortune around the Black family. What you're saying is that organizations need to better understand the Black family in order to fully include black people in their organizations. So can you maybe just tell us a little bit about what you told a couple of stories in there about your own experiences. Perhaps you could share those with us and we'll go from there.
Yeah, if you think about corporate in general, corporate has people and people come from families, right? So there's a connection to every family in that regard. And you asked about some of the experience that I've had along the way within my corporate journey that I shared within the article that was in Fast Company, and it was also in Fortune as well. And I talk a little bit about the experiences, the very different experiences that African American or Black families experience in the workforce. And so one of them was around the fact that I was working from home, because although remote work seems to be new for many, many people, it's something that I've done for quite a bit of time. And my daughter walked in and I was on a conference call and she heard me having a conversation. And, when I ended the conversation, she really wanted to understand why, to her young ears, if you will, I sounded so very different on that call than she's ever heard me sound. And a big part of that is because in order to be heard and accepted within the corporate culture, there's a need to speak in a way that can be digested, if you will, by others. And so you learn how to do this thing in the community that we call code switching. And it's really, she didn't ask me any additional questions. So let me just say thank goodness for that. But it's really about how, many times we have to manage our entire identity for work very differently than we do in our personal lives, so that it can be acceptable and digestible, if you will, in the corporate culture, because the corporate culture has tended to be built around a dominant culture versus a diverse culture.
So that relates very much, I think, you mentioned in the articles this notion of bringing your whole self to work. I guess what you're saying is, when organizations say that and you hear them say it a lot, they better mean it, right? And not just the part of yourself that they deem acceptable, right?
Well, absolutely. And here's why that's important. It's important because you cannot get the best out of people if they can't bring all of themselves to the environment. And then the other challenge around bringing your whole self to work is, the fear of, is that going to be accepted in what has been systematically established as normal, right?
Right.
And so you have to, I'm really big on what I call resetting the table, right? Because you come into an environment that has been crafted for a dominant majority. But in order for others that maybe have been marginalized and systematically left out, you may need to reset that table or reframe that environment in order to really make them be included and heard and valued.
And the other example from the article you use is when you're often in a social situation with colleagues and they're talking about how they're going to pay for their kids' college, and your response to that in terms of the conversations you have to have with your kids. As you could just share that as well.
Yeah. No, I'm happy to share that because it could be viewed as an uncomfortable conversation. I tend to think that it's uncomfortable because we aren't having the right conversations enough, right? And so, that example that I gave was primarily around, talking about paying for college tuition, which is something that I believe every parent it has on their mind, and that does include me. And I happen to have twins, so think of it. For me, it's double, right? So that's one thing. But here's where it gets sticky when we're talking about what's top of mind. One of the things that's very top of mind for me in my household, or things that I've had to navigate, has been having to have talks with my young adults in order to make sure that they come home safely from a routine traffic stop, right? Where their life is on the line potentially, right? That's keeping me up at night. Paying for college, man, when I look at that, I'm like, yeah, I can figure that out. But how am I going to keep my son or my daughter alive just because of a target of who they are?
Yeah, and I'm sort of thinking about those two examples. The one about having to sort of put on a bit of a mask in terms of how you present yourself at work, and the other thing is about these sort of anxieties about family members that other groups maybe don't have. I mean, those are both things which take quite a large psychological toll on you. And I know one of the things, it's not one of the things that you're specifically speaking about at the conference, but is about sort of mental health and the impact on your mental health, combined with this presumably has been combined with the sort of COVID thing. This has been and the the killing of George Floyd, the aftermath of that. This must have been to say the least, a tough year, right?
Well, it's interesting. It's been more than a tough year. I think about my 25 plus years in tech, right? And I feel like this is the year where it's probably more visible than in other years, right? It's certainly not that it happened in this year, it's that it's more visible in this past year. Because imagine needing to go into an environment that, in some ways, I'm going to use some analogies here. You go into an environment where you need to fight every day, right, in order to be able just to survive, in order to, you're constantly navigating landmines, you're constantly navigating diminishing attacks, you're constantly navigating potential unconscious bias, and in some instances it's intentional bias, right? So this is your world. And so it is extremely stressful in regular, whatever was normal previously. Now add to that, right? Add to that the stress of the pandemic. Add to that the climate and culture of some of the things politically and in other ways that has come to light. And it's excruciating. And I like to say it's like 1,000 paper cuts to the soul And if you can just think of how much a paper cut hurts, trying to navigate that, you know?
Yes, and thank you for sharing that. And it seems to me that one of the things that COVID has done, and you mentioned about how you'd worked remotely before, that it has given us a window on the lives, sort of the private lives, as it were, of the people that we work with that we wouldn't otherwise have had. And I know I was doing an interview when COVID began with someone who's very active in the DEI space, and she was saying she thought this was going to be a good thing, that this would create greater empathy and understanding. And I know those are things that you stress in your article that leaders need. Would you agree with that? That this has helped facilitate greater empathy and understanding with people?
So I certainly think it's created a lot more visibility. I think it's created a lot more conversation.
Mm-hmm.
But has it created greater empathy? I'm not sure.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is conversation does not translate directly into a change, right? Change is very intentional. And so I think there's visibility. I think there's conversation. Could it create greater empathy? Yes, it can, but there's a contingency. And the contingency of it creating greater empathy is the creation of greater intention to make a change.
And how do we do that?
We solved that, and we're done.
Okay, all right. Yeah, and I think that moving on, I think so. We've got these sort of three things that people need to show: empathy, understanding, intention. And you've described some very your very sort of personal experiences over the last year, plus more generally. But in your article, you recommend three things that you think employers should do to operationalize that we need to move, in a sense, beyond that notion of empathy into action. So perhaps you could just share briefly those three things that you were saying you think employers need to do.
Absolutely. And I do want to take a quick step back to what you said around the empathy piece. I do believe that the code to cracking the greater empathy is going to come from the commonality of humanity and assigning commonality of humanity to everyone. Because part of what has happened is the dehumanization that has become systematically accepted, right? And so you can't empathize because you don't view them the same as you, right? And we need to view one another. And I am adamant that this transcends race, right? This is beyond race. This is race. This is religion. This is veteran status. This is economic status. This is, gender, insert, right?
Yes. Yeah.
That human commonality and the acceptance and belief that we are all one people that have common needs, common goals, common desires, and should be treated with the same human treatment and focus as any other entity.
And that's certainly something which I'd say, from my experience, is something that Televerdi put into practice in terms of the employment of incarcerated women, right?
Absolutely, because, it's very easy to, again, you dehumanize by assigning dehumanizing nomenclature, right? By diminishing the value. So what is dehumanizing nomenclature? Criminal, inmate, right? So now you've taken away, you're distancing them from being human, right? We do the same thing when, in gender, and we can do the same thing in race. And so you create these words, you create these stereotypes, and you perpetuate them, and you normalize them, and you have removed the human commonality from an entire population, right? So we definitely look to do that because these are people, these are women who need to have a second chance. But this is something that then transcends into everything else.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does that make sense?
No, absolutely, and you see it historically in terms of how groups are marginalised through language and turned into the other. Absolutely. So,
Absolutely.
but if you could share those three sort of, I mean, I test those as recommendations, the
Absolutely.
things you think employers should be doing to kind of address some of these issues.
Absolutely, because when you think about, again, the Black family, and every family type is represented at work, but we're talking about those specific challenges. And so one of the recommendations that I made was around paid family leave. And, there's a lot of data that supports it. So I'm not going to go down a big data conversation, but I will say this. We'll talk about the fact that, if you think about the additional mental and emotional stress that I talked about in working in the corporate environment, it is draining, it is painful, and, it takes a toll on a population where, if you really, really think about it, the majority of the heads of households, and this is just a data point, right, tend to be Black women. And we tend to have to care for, other generations and extended family. And so you have an extra weight. You have had potentially less earnings over time, right? Money over time. And then you've had this additional toll on your mental and emotional health caring for others. So the paid family leave allows for the workers to be able to take care of their family, but it also allows them to replenish and be able to bring their best self back into the work environment. And it's a simple thing to do, right?
Yeah. Well, I know it's something that's come up in a lot of conversations I've had lately through people who are experiencing grief and loss specifically, and the need, in the light of COVID, the need for employers to be more compassionate around that and allow people more
Oh
time.
my
So
gosh.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, so I was trying not to go down into a really deep conversation, but 33% of hospitalized COVID patients were Black, and yet only 18% of the community being evaluated was Black. So we're facing greater economic difficulty. We're facing greater mental health challenges. And then think about some of the systematic things that were already in play around access to health care, right? Access to proper, different nutritious foods for sure. So, I mean, all of the things that were already in play now add this pandemic on top of it. And by the way, the majority of the workers impacted by COVID, because I'm very fortunate to be in an industry where I can work from home. However, when we talk about service oriented workers who are at greater risk, they tend to be, more diverse cultures that are in those services led industries, and they end up being more at risk, right? And then going back, it's this perpetual cycle, right? Where one thing is feeding another. And so we must be very, very conscious of that.
right. And I think one of the other things that you mentioned in the article was around pay equity for Black Americans and the pay disparity.
Absolutely. And here's where there is you hear a lot around the gender pay gap. And so I want to kind of narrow things here so we don't go all the way to talk about just the gap in general. But if you think about Black women earn 41 cents, I believe, something like 41 cents, or Black 61 cents for every dollar that a white male earns. 61 cents. You think about the fact that also the gender piece. Now we're talking about the race piece. Now let's add the gender piece, right?
Yes.
You start to truly understand that I believe that the Caucasian counterpart earns about 82 cents for every dollar. Look at the gap by gender, look at the gap by race. So now Black women are getting hit. However, if you also look at the data, Black women are some of the most educated, one of the largest populations of educated folks. And honestly, 67.5% of Black mothers are the primary breadwinner in the household. And yet we are making 61. And I said we because I am one, right? 61 cents on the dollar with a perpetual loss in the sense that we also have not earned as much money over time historically for the family, right? And we're earning less in the workforce, not because we're doing less work, right? Not because we're not doing the same job, but because there's a system in place that has made it okay to have these pay disparities. And we know about it. So here's where it gets really icky for me. We know it. What are we going to do about it? You need to pay. I'm not even going to make it about paying them their worth. Pay Black women who are taking care of their families, who are doing their job, who are, pay them what they have rightfully earned, right? By being a part of your organization and accepting the work. It's just not okay to say we're going to pay this individual this much, we're going to pay this individual this much because of race and or gender or other factors. That's just not okay.
And it's something which is very much in control of, in the control of individual employers. And the third thing you mentioned is also a financial piece around college debt, right? That you'd like to see some forgiveness of that.
So if you think about what I've shared around what I like to call generational wealth and how Black families have been left out largely, right, of being able to pass generational wealth because of the systematic things that have been in place, right? And then I shared earlier around how the educational levels of Black women are really, really high. And if you look at the data, I think it's something around, it's a $25,000 more student loan debt than white college graduates. So not only are we have less wealth, we're earning less money, but then we're racking up more debt in order to get the same job and get paid less. I'm just sitting it out there. To say that out loud actually just was like, holy cow, right? And so if you think about that, why would we not, as part of a total compensation package, consider the forgiveness of some of that debt? Right? Debt that we have assumed so that we could have a chance to play in a system that, again, was set up for a dominant culture that did not initially include this part of the population.
And I know you mentioned in your article a couple of organisations that are doing something to address that. So again, that's something which, while it's a sort of a larger government thing in many ways, it's also something individual employers can impact. I think we're going to have to close there. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm so looking forward to sharing the screen with you in May 24th to 26th at our DEI conference, and really appreciate you coming along and being our first guest. I think you've covered a lot of the issues that that we'll be speaking to at the event. Firstly, I think grounding the conversation in personal experience. Secondly, that focus on really our common humanity. But thirdly, that we need to move beyond those two things to actually do things that create systemic change for people and improve everyone's lives. So thank you so much, Deanna, for joining us today. And like I say, looking forward to chatting with you again in May and I'm sure before then as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.